Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and welcome to the Monday Night Review. We are on episode... Oh my goodness, I'm going to have to check. Are we on episode 60? We're on episode 60. I don't know why that feels like a big deal, but it does. I've had 2 hours sleep. I'm in my pyjamas. I have a snoring dog at the end of my bed, so if you can hear weird snortling noises, it's a Patterdale Terrier. And I've had 2 hours of sleep. I just said that. Let's see how we go. I'd love to give a big Monday Night Review shout out to Joanne, who is our latest joiner in the Patreon. You get lots of extra little stories and mini-sodes and stuff over there, so go and check it out. Also, you get everything ad-free. All episodes ad-free, so go and have a look at the Patreon, which is the Monday Night Review, but also we will have a link in the show notes below. So it's summer holidays. I am trying to keep up with my reading, but also trying to make sure that my kids have a nice summer holiday and trying to do my actual work as well. Hence why this is Tuesday already and not Monday. I had just a really nice day with my mum and my sister. I could make up some dramatic story, but I just had a very nice lunch with my mum and my sister, and then we mooched around the shops. And when I got back, I had to do parenting stuff and dog care stuff, and I was then knackered. I've got no good excuse. I was just living my life, which is a good excuse in its own way. Today we're going to talk about a murder that took place a while ago, and you'll probably wonder why this case is such a big deal, but I'm going to tell you why when we get into it. So today we're going to be talking about the murder of Kitty Genovese. Catherine Susan Genovese, known as Kitty, was born in Brooklyn, New York City on the 7th of July 1935. She's the eldest of 5 children to an Italian-American parents, Rachel and Vincent, and they lived in a brownstone residence at 29 St. John's Place in Park Slope, which is a western Brooklyn neighbourhood mainly populated by families of Italian and Irish heritage, and so, like many of their neighbours, the Genovese family were Catholics. In her teenage years, Genovese attended the all-girl Prospect Heights High School, where she was recalled as being self-assured beyond her years and having a really sunny disposition. Now, in 1954, the Genovese family moved to New Canaan in Connecticut after Kitty's mother, Rachel, witnesses a murder and just decides it's not safe for them to live there anymore, which is very much foreshadowing. Kitty has just recently graduated from high school, and she stays in Brooklyn with her grandparents to prepare for her upcoming marriage, which is held later that year. But the marriage is annulled by the end of 1954. We don't have a lot of information about her marriage, but as we get into the story later, we can make assumptions, which is never a good idea, but we can get a vague idea as to what might have led to this. So after her marriage is annulled, she's older. She's a ex-married lady, so she's kind of free in a way. She moves to an apartment in Brooklyn and works at a clerical job, which she doesn't enjoy at all. It's not her jam. And by the late 1950s, she's accepted a position as a bartender, and this seems to really suit her. Again, I think it suits her lifestyle. I think she's quite a people person. She's quite fun, and at the time, she is living in a way that probably her Catholic upbringing wouldn't have approved of. So in August 1961, she's briefly arrested for bookmaking. She's been taking bets on horse races from the people who go to the bar, and she and her friend Dee are both fined $50 each, and Kitty gets fired. I'm assuming Dee gets fired as well. So then Genovese gets another bartending position at a bar called Eve's 11th Hour Bar on Jamaica Avenue and 193rd Street in Hollis in Queens. And the owner is not really around, so she ends up being promoted to manager, and she seems to really do well here and excel, and she works double shifts to save money because she has this dream that she wants to open her own Italian restaurant, which I have no doubt that she would have done. She's putting in these double shifts, she's saving money, and she does like to go out, but obviously if you're working as a bartender, you're often out until late anyway. So she has a social life, but she's obviously got this dream that she's working towards. Now, one of the reasons I think maybe Kitty's marriage didn't work out is that she is gay, as far as we know, or bisexual, and she meets her girlfriend Marianne Zelenko in a club in Greenwich Village in 1963, and they seem to have they have a very happy relationship, and they move into an apartment in the Kew Gardens area of Queens. They move to 82 to 70 Austin Street, which is considered a really peaceful and safe area to live. Now, of course, at the time, this probably wouldn't have been seen as an acceptable relationship for lots of people, so they were technically roommates, but obviously to their friends and a lot of their neighbours, probably everyone knew that they were in a relationship. They seemed very happy, and Kitty's life seems to be on the right track. She's got a job, she's got responsibility, she gets paid well because she is managing the bar. She's saving to open her Italian restaurant. She's in a relationship. She's happy. They've got a nice flat in a good area. But this is all about to go wrong. So at approximately 2:30 in the morning on the 13th of March 1964, Kitty leaves the bar where she's working and begins driving home in her red Fiat. Arriving home at around 3:15 in the morning, she parks her car in the Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad Station parking lot where she always parked, which is about 100 feet, 30 metres from her apartment door. Now, her apartment door is in an alleyway to the rear of the building, so she has to go down an alleyway to get to it. And as she walks towards the apartment complex, she's approached by a man with a knife. So Kitty runs towards the front of the building. The man runs after her, overtakes her and stabs her twice in the back. And Kitty screams, "Oh my God, he stabbed me, help me, help me." Several neighbours hear her cry out. Only a few of them seem to have recognised the sound as a cry for help. Lots of people will have thought it was a domestic situation. And as I said in a previous episode, which I cannot remember which episode it was, sadly, domestic violence, I think maybe it was with Ruth Ellis, who was a similar time, but in London, domestic violence was so common. It was something that you didn't interfere in. It was something that, happened a lot and wasn't surprising. So some people say they just thought it was a domestic happening. So the lights coming on in the windows scare the attacker off, and he stands in the shadows for a bit, and then he comes back and continues stabbing Kitty. When Robert Mozza, one of the neighbours, shouts at the attacker, "Let that girl alone," the attacker runs away, and Genovese slowly makes her way towards the rear entrance of the building. She's seriously injured, but she's out of view of any of the witnesses, and there's as we'll get into, there's very mixed opinions about who saw what, but if they think it's a domestic, they won't necessarily know that there was a knife involved. So I think nobody really who saw it at this point thought that there was much going on. Mozza sees the man get into his car and drive away, but then sees him return 10 minutes later. The attacker's now got a hat on. He's got a wide-brimmed hat and he's shadowing his face, and he systematically searches the parking lot, the station, and then the apartment complex, eventually finding Kitty, who is barely conscious and lying in a hallway at the back of the building where she's tried to get in, but a locked door has prevented her from getting inside. and they are out of view of the street and basically out of the way of anyone who may have seen the original attack. And here the man stabs Kitty several more times before raping her, stealing $49 and running away again. The attacks spanned approximately half an hour, and the knife wounds in Genovese's hands suggest that she attempted to defend herself and that there may be marks on her attacker. Records of the earliest calls to the police are unclear and were not given high priority. The incident occurred 4 years before New York City implemented the 911 emergency call system. So you'd have to call the operator who would then put you through to your local police precinct. Very difficult for us to imagine a world where you can't just, for us in Britain, to pick up the phone and dial 999 and America 911. It seems strange to imagine a time where actually it was quite tricky to get hold of the police and it wasn't your go-to. I feel now if we see something, we're like, phone 999. Whereas before then it was like, are the police going to do anything? Is it going to cause us more trouble than it's worth? And am I going to piss off a neighbour who's just having a domestic with his wife? So one witness and his father called the police after the initial attack and reported that a woman was beat up but got up and was staggering around. So they definitely received that call. So then a neighbour and close friend called Sophia Farah, who died fairly recently in 2016 and is a bit of a hero, she lives across the hall from Kitty and Marianne, and she rushes out to Kitty, forcing open a wedged door in the vestibule behind the building where the stabbing had taken place, despite not knowing if the attacker was still there or not. And she finds Kitty in a pool of blood and she screams for a neighbour to call the police, and she then cradles Kitty until the ambulance arrives, whispering help is on the way. So even though it's an awful attack for Kitty, and I don't know how she must have felt when she'd crawled to the vestibule and maybe thought she was safe for him to return, it must have just been awful. And Sophia has just done amazingly to support her at this time. So Kitty's picked up by an ambulance at 4:15 and in the morning and dies en route to the hospital. She would be buried on March the 16th, 1964 in Lakeview Cemetery in New Canaan in Connecticut, which must have been incredibly hard for her girlfriend. And her girlfriend's in fact woken up at 4 a.m. It says 4 a.m. Obviously, if she died on the way in at 4:15, so it's a little bit of funniness going on. But she's woken up by detectives who say that Kitty's been attacked, and in some cases, Kitty's died. Obviously, the timings are a little out there. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Detective Mitchell Sang comes over to question her. She, at the time, is being consoled by neighbour Carl Ross, who Sang would eventually arrest for disorderly contact after he found him disruptive to the interview. Sang also knew that Kitty's body had been found at the bottom stairs to Ross's apartment, so he was quite suspicious of Ross. By all accounts, Ross had been drinking, so he was probably being quite annoying if you're trying to interview someone. Marianne was later interrogated for 6 hours by detectives John Carroll and Jerry Burns, who are homicide detectives, and they basically just questioned her about her relationship with Kitty with incredibly pointless, intense questions about their sex life. So unnecessary, has nothing to do with her attack. And this is also the police's first focus when they start to interview the neighbours. Now, initially, Zelenko was a suspect, despite witnesses seeing a man commit the attack, giving a description of the car that he was driving, and presumably some of these witnesses would have known Marianne, so would have been able to identify her. And they were very clear, even in the 911 calls that we know they received, there's a man attacking a woman. Now, obviously, people can get confused, but I would just assume that they would know. I don't think Marianne's very tall, for example. I feel like they would have recognised her and probably not called the police if it was two women fighting. So on the 19th of March 1964, 6 days after the stabbing, a man named Winston Mosley was arrested for suspected robbery in Ozone Park after a television set's found in the trunk of his car. So his car had been searched after a local man, Raoul Cleary, had become suspicious watching Mosley remove a television from Cleary's neighbour's house. Now, Cleary questions Mosley, who says that he's working for a removals company, but then Cleary goes and checks with another neighbour, Jack Brown, who says those guys aren't moving anywhere. And Cleary calls the police while Brown disables Mosley's car to ensure he can't get away. That's good neighbouring. That's the good neighbouring that gets overlooked in this story. Luckily, a detective who gets called to this case remembers that this white car that Mosley drives is similar to one that was reported by some of the witnesses to Kitty's murder, and he tells detectives Carroll and Sang. And when they take Mosley in, they also note that he has scabs on his hands, which could be as a result of defending himself against Kitty. So during questioning, Mosley admits to the murder of Kitty, but he also admits to murdering two other women, Annie Mae Johnson, who'd been shot and burned to death in her apartment in South Ozone Park a few weeks earlier, and 15-year-old Barbara Kralik, who had been stabbed to death in her parents' Springfield Gardens home the previous July. Now, he does this without much prompting. He doesn't seem that remorseful about it. And what's really weird is that two men, one of them is Mosley, confessed to the crime of murdering Barbara Kralik, though 19-year-old Alvin L. Mitchell, who is eventually convicted for the crime, said that he confessed under duress. Basically, when she's found murdered, he is suspect number one, as he's a bit weird. He knew her, they hung out together, and he was the one that everyone said had done it, and he is then held and beaten and basically kept awake and led. He's told what to say. They say if he says that he did it in a moment of madness, he'll just go to a hospital for 2 years. So he confesses, and then they record him confessing, and then the next day he recants it. But Mosley willingly confessed and even goes to the first trial. He gets taken to Mitchell's first trial and confesses. So you've got Mitchell saying he didn't do it and he confessed under duress, and Mosley saying he absolutely did do it. This trial results in a hung jury. It should be, obviously, to us, it would be a really clear-cut case. One guy saying that he confessed under duress, another one saying that he readily did it. But Mitchell's account is not that accurate, but that's understandable if he didn't do it. Whereas Mitchell, he does definitely get some things that they believe only the murderer would know, but there are also some inaccuracies. He says that he stabbed Annie Mae Johnson when she's obviously shot. So there's a hung jury at Mitchell's first trial, and then there's a retrial at which Mosley didn't go to, and Mitchell was found guilty at that trial, which seems like such a... And Mosley's never tried for these other two murders. So even though he confessed, and one man is serving a sentence wrongly, as far as we know, that doesn't matter. So who is Winston Mosley? He's born in Manhattan on the 2nd of March 1935 to Fanny Mosley and her husband Alphonse Mosley, who, it would turn out, was not Winston's biological father. Winston only finds this out later into his childhood, where his parents separated for a while, which they did quite often by all accounts. He is a bright but troubled boy who has this obsessive fascination with ants, which I can't decide if that's incredibly wholesome or incredibly weird. We don't know what he was doing with the ants, but it's noted that it's described as an inordinate fascination with ants. So he marries his first wife, Pauline, in 1954. They divorce, and then he marries Elizabeth Grant in 1961. At the time of Kitty's murder, 29-year-old Winston Mosley was married with 2 or 3 children, hard to get an accurate description on that, and has no prior criminal records. He's soft-spoken, intelligent. He owns his home in the South Ozone Park area of Queens. He operates business machines in Mount Vernon, New York. He lives with his wife, who is a night shift hospital nurse, and his mother, who would help look after the children, freeing Mosley up for his nighttime rampaging. Now, later in confessions and in his testimony, he would say that he would drive around late at night seeking victims, that he had killed 3 women, including Kitty, raped 8, and committed 30 to 40 burglaries. Now, on the night of Kitty's murder, Mosley had been driving around for a couple of hours. He was sitting in his car and he spotted Kitty in her red Fiat as she was waiting at a traffic light. So he follows her. When asked for a reason of the attack, he doesn't have one. He just says he wanted to kill a woman. He does say that he kills women because they're easier than men. He's not a big guy. So he says he stabbed her twice in the back with a hunting knife, and she screamed and pleaded for help, and he ran off because he saw the lights of the neighbours come on. And he then returned. He hadn't finished what he set out to do, so he returns to rape and kill her. In his confession, Mosley says, "I had a feeling this man would close his window and go back to sleep, and sure enough he did." In court, he said, "I realised the car was parked where people could see it and me, so I moved it some distance away. I came back because I'd not finished what I set out to do." He never showed any remorse for the crimes he committed. He did have a pretty eventful life behind bars. He was condemned to die in the electric chair for the murder of Kitty Genovese, but in 1967, 2 years after the New York state abolished most capital punishments, he won an appeal that reduced his sentence to an indeterminate life term. So he's then at Attica Correctional Facility, and in 1968 he escapes while on a hospital visit to Buffalo for a self-inflicted injury. Now everywhere I see this reported as a self-inflicted injury, and then I find out what this injury is, and it turns out he'd shoved a soup can up his own rectum in a bid to get taken to the hospital wing so that he could escape. Now, so bear in mind for the next part of the story, he's doing all of this having just had a soup can removed from his rectum. He attacks the prison guard. He beats the prison guard so badly that the prison guard's blood vessels in his eyes burst and runs off. While on the run, he gets 2 women, ties them up, rapes them. He then gets another woman and her children, and she holds them hostage at gunpoint, and then he is eventually recaptured. So he literally, as soon as he gets out, it's not like he gets out, keeps his head down. He literally, the first thing he does is rapes some women. So I'm not having any single millimetre of me is feeling bad for Mosley. So he's given 2 further 15-year sentences to run concurrently after his life sentence. So they don't say how long his life sentence is going to be, and he basically has to do another 30 on top of any life sentence. Anyway, so he's pretty much staying in prison forever. He joined in the 1971 Attica Uprising, which is one of the prison riots with the most, one of the most violent prison riots in American history, even though the majority of killing was done by the police. He earns a college degree in sociology in 1977, and he's rejected 18 times at parole hearings. The latest one was in 2015. So, despite having had a glimpse of freedom by escaping and immediately finding a gun, raping people, and taking people hostage, he still appeals. So, the murder of Kitty Genovese is one of the most famous in New York's history, which is really saying something, as there were a lot of murders in New York. And at the time that she died, her murder was just one of 636 in the city that year. So why would this one make such an impact? Well, it was the shocking revelation in the press coverage that alleged that there were loads of witnesses to the attack and who saw the murder and who refused to come to help Kitty. Now, this has been disproved over time, but not before it became part of the accepted law of the crime and had a huge ripple effect. On the 27th of March, 1964, so just after her murder, the New York Times ran an article titled 37 Who Saw Murder Didn't Call the Police, alleging that multiple neighbours, technically 38, they lost one in the heading, had heard or witnessed Kitty's murder and did nothing to help her. And the story came from a conversation between the editor, A.M. Rosenthal, and Police Commissioner Michael Murphy, who had made the claim to him over lunch. The next day, after this headline, the newspaper followed up with interviews with experts in psychology discussing why people would choose to not get involved. The article stated, for more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. And people were rightfully horrified. Now, we'd always probably will mention how the press can affect a case, or a press can really have a bad skew on cases and can really direct public feeling and can control a case. We'll see it with the Yorkshire Ripper when we get to the Yorkshire Ripper, but how the press can almost skew a whole investigation. But in this case, this mistake in the press really kickstarts a lot of things in American law and in the New York law that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. So although it's distressing for the neighbours, who rightly, a lot of them felt pissed off to be tarred with this brush, it does have a very interesting effect. So the phenomenon would become known as the Bystander Effect, or Genovese syndrome, which attempts to explain why someone who witnesses a crime would not help the victim. Researchers believe this is all because being part of a crowd alters the sense of personal responsibility, and this feeling is reinforced by witnesses' need to behave in a socially acceptable way. So if the situation is ambiguous, then they become more reluctant to get involved. A 1969 study found that 70% of people would help a woman in distress if they were the only person present, but only 40% intervened when other witnesses were there too. It's been discovered that the more witnesses there are, the less likely it is that anyone will intervene. So basically, we're all sheep. If other people around you are not doing anything, you're less likely to do something because you feel no responsibility. And you want to behave in a socially acceptable way that appeals to the masses. And so if the masses are not helping, you're less likely to help. Interestingly, the whole story of the 38 witnesses has been debunked, partly by the families involved and by Kitty's family. There were actually only 2 witnesses that we know of, and no one saw the attacks, of which there were 2, not 3, as reported in the paper, in full. One of the witnesses was Carl Ross, who was consoling Marianne the morning after Kitty died. And he had heard noises, and after deliberation, he opened his door a crack to investigate. He saw Kitty lying on the ground, still alive, attempting to speak, and Mosley stabbing her. He shuts the door, calls a friend to ask what to do. Remember, there's no 911 to call, and the friend says not to get involved, which is not what I would do, but I totally get not wanting your friend to risk getting stabbed. But let's just remember Sophia Farah, who just ran out there and didn't know if the attacker was still out there. Everyone's different. You can't tell what you would do in that situation, and as much as I would like to think that I would grab a kitchen knife and run out there screaming and hope that the fucking coward is going to run off, you just don't know. Also, we know that Carl Ross had been drinking. Never helps your decision making. So Ross eventually climbs out of his window, goes round to a neighbour's apartment, and he's there when he hears Sophie Farah calling for someone to call the police, and he calls the police. His explanation is, I didn't want to get involved. And this becomes a famous rejoinder of the bystander effect. When people are talking about it, it's, I just don't want to get involved. Whatever the facts were on the night of the murder of Kitty Genovese, it became a morality tale for those growing up in New York, and a parable about the isolation and lack of empathy among city dwellers. In fact, the murder of Kitty Genovese is credited as one of the factors that pushed the emergency 911 system into place, after New York City officials joined in a national effort involving the officials in other cities. It became the national emergency number in 1968. It also initiated the forming of neighbourhood watch programs and influenced, at least in part, the Good Samaritan laws, which give legal protection to those who give reasonable assistance to anyone in peril. So these are all huge differences. The change to making a centralised 911 number is huge. Neighbourhood watch programs were set up. People in the city were rightly kind of outraged to be tarred with this brush. So a lot of people who lived, especially in areas like Kitty and Marianne, where it was considered a nice, safe neighbourhood, and it was, by all accounts, a nice, safe neighbourhood for Queens in the 60s. It was where families lived. They set up neighbourhood watch programs and they banded together. The murder of Kitty Genovese was the most cited incident in social psychology literature until the September 11th attacks of 2001. So before September 11th, 2001, it had the most effect on social psychology because of the way that people were perceived to have responded to a crime they witnessed, even though we know that didn't happen. Winston Mosey dies at the age of 81 on the 28th of March 2016, still in prison, never got out, never got parole, never really showed remorse. And that is the story of the murder of Kitty Genovese and the development of the 911 Good Samaritan laws and neighbourhood watch schemes that it inspired. I hope you enjoyed that episode. I'm sorry if there was a lot of noise. I have kids running around. I'm still in my pyjamas. I'm like a zombie. You can find us on social media. I'll always put pictures up to go with this so you can see the amazing Kitty and all of that. And you can find us on social media at The Monday Night Review on TikTok, Instagram and Facebook. You can find us on YouTube now. And you can go and find extra content and things on Patreon, where you just search for The Monday Night Review. And you can email me, themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. And remember that review is spelled REVUE. I'm watching my dog chase a rabbit in his dreams, which is quite sweet. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, And always check the back seat before you drive.